That was the night I called my mother, not to cry, not to ask for advice. I called her because I needed someone to know exactly where I was standing and what had just happened to me, so that if I walked back into that house, there would be at least one person in the world who could say, "She told me. She warned me." This wasn't nothing. That was the night everything shifted, and I think about it still, not because I'm bitter, though I was, for a long time, but because I genuinely didn't see it coming. I thought I was walking into a family. Turns out I was walking into an audition I never agreed to take. I need to back up. My name is Rachel. I was 32 when this happened. I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-size construction firm in Calgary, the kind of job where you're on your phone before your coffee's ready and still answering emails when the news comes on. I'd been at the company for 6 years, worked my way up from admin, and I was good at it. That part matters. Actually, not because I need you to think well of me, but because of what came later. Because of what someone decided to say about me at my own engagement party, in front of 47 people, while I was holding a glass of Prosecco and trying to remember the name of my fiancé's second cousin. His name was Daniel Hurst. We met at a work conference in Edmonton. He was in commercial real estate. I was there for a procurement seminar, and we ended up at the same table at the dinner portion where neither of us wanted to be. We talked for 4 hours. He was funny in this dry, quiet way that I didn't expect. He drove me to the airport the next morning and asked if he could text me. I said yes. That was 3 years before the party. Daniel was the kind of man who made sense in your life. He was steady. He was considerate. He called when he said he'd call. He remembered things, not in a rehearsed way, but genuinely. He remembered that I hated cilantro and that I always got cold in movie theaters, and that my grandmother's birthday was in March, and that I liked the window seat on planes even if it meant climbing over people. He was good. I want to be clear about that because this story is not really about Daniel being a bad person. It's about Daniel being someone who had never, in 35 years, learned how to say no to his mother. Her name was Lorraine Hurst. I knew from early on that Lorraine was a presence. Daniel mentioned her the way people mention weather, frequently, with a kind of resignation, as if it were simply a condition of life that had to be worked around. She called him every Sunday, not texted, called, for at least an hour. The first time I was at his apartment on a Sunday and the call came in, I watched his whole body language change. He sat up straighter. His voice went a half step quieter. He started agreeing to things. After the call, he'd be fine again. But I noticed. I met Lorraine for the first time about 5 months into dating Daniel. She lived in Red Deer, about 90 minutes south of Calgary, in a house that was large in the way that says money was spent, but taste was never consulted. It had a formal dining room that I don't think anyone ate in, and a living room with a cream-colored sectional that looked like it had never held a human body. Everything in the house was arranged to impress people who weren't there. Lorraine herself was tall, well-dressed in that studied way, and she had this smile that arrived slightly before she meant it to, like a reflex she'd trained herself into. She hugged me at the door. She told me she'd heard so much about me. She asked about my job, and when I explained what I did, there was this small pause, barely a second, before she said, "Oh, how practical." Not a compliment, a filing system. She'd taken the information I gave her and put it in a drawer labeled manageable. Dinner was fine. She was pleasant. She asked about my family. When I mentioned that my dad had passed away 5 years earlier and that my mom and I were close, she said, "That's so lovely that you have each other," with exactly the energy of someone who has just been told something they find mildly inconvenient. On the drive back, I told Daniel she seemed nice. He nodded. Then he said, "She can take some getting used to." I should have asked him to finish that sentence. I didn't. The proposal happened on a Tuesday evening, which I loved. It wasn't a grand gesture, no restaurants or flash mobs, just us walking along the river pathway near Eau Claire. And him stopping at a bench we'd sat at before and pulling out a ring that he'd had sized correctly on the first try, which honestly might have been the most romantic part. I said yes. I cried a little. We called people from the path, with the skyline behind us going orange and pink. I called my mum first. She screamed. She cried. She said, "Oh, Rach," in the way only mothers can, where it means 17 things at once. Daniel called Lorraine. That call lasted 47 minutes. I know because I was sitting on the bench watching the river while it happened. I didn't ask him what they talked about. He didn't volunteer. I told myself it was fine. People process things differently. She was his mother. I told myself a lot of things. The engagement party was planned for about 3 months after the proposal. It was Lorraine's idea, which should have been my first signal, and it was held at the Hearst family home in Red Deer, which should have been my second. I suggested we do something in Calgary, closer to my friends, more neutral ground, and Daniel said it would mean a lot to her, and I said fine because I loved him and because I genuinely believed at that point that Lorraine was just a particular personality type and not an active weather system. My mother was invited. She drove down from Okotoks, brought flowers, wore her good blue blazer. My 2 best friends, Jess and Preet, came down from Calgary. Beyond that, the guest list was largely Lorraine's production. Daniel's aunts and uncles, family friends, a few colleagues of Lorraine's who I'd never met. I want to note for the record, my father's side of the family was not invited. I have an uncle in Calgary, 2 cousins. They weren't on the list. When I asked Daniel about it, he said his mum had kept the guest list intimate, that there wasn't room for everyone. There were 47 people in that house. I noticed. I didn't say anything. The party started at 6. By 7, things seemed fine, normal, even. People mingled. Someone had arranged crudités in a pattern that suggested more effort than was necessary. There was a cheese board. Daniel was across the room talking to an uncle and laughing, and I remember thinking, okay, this is okay. Maybe I was wrong to worry. I was standing near the kitchen with Jess and a woman named Sandra, a friend of Lorraine's, when Lorraine herself came over. She had that smile on, the early one. She touched my arm and said, "Rachel, I'd love to introduce you to a few people." I smiled. Jess gave me a small look that I clocked and filed away. Lorraine steered me toward a cluster of older relatives near the fireplace. She introduced me to a woman named Aunt Beverly, to a couple whose names I immediately lost, to a man named Douglas who had opinions about the Flames. And then there was a pause in the introductions, and Lorraine said, still smiling, still light, as if she were commenting on the weather, "Daniel's done so well for himself. We're so proud of how far he's come. He deserves someone who can really keep up." I felt it. That specific sentence landing somewhere below my sternum. I kept my expression. I said, "He's a remarkable person." She looked at me. Then she said, "Of course, we always imagine someone from more of a comparable background. But Daniel has always been independent that way." The cluster of relatives had gone very quiet. Beverly was suddenly studying the mantel. I said, still calm, "I think we're well matched." I excused myself. I went to find my mum. She was talking to Preet near the back hallway, and when she saw my face, she said, "What happened?" I told her. She put her hand on mine and said, "Stay calm. Don't give her anything." I went back out. I found Daniel, told him quietly that his mother had said something odd. He nodded slowly. He said, "She just worries. She doesn't mean anything by it." He squeezed my hand. I went to get a glass of water. Lorraine found me in the kitchen. There was no preamble this time. She said, I need to be direct with you, Rachel. And then, I still, even now, struggle to believe this happened. She told me that she had spoken to several people about my background, and that she had concerns, and that she felt Daniel deserved to understand what he was getting into. That she had spoken to Daniel's old colleagues. She used the phrase, limited means. She used the phrase, not the kind of family we're accustomed to. I put my glass down. I said, Lorraine, I think we should have this conversation another time. This isn't. And she slapped me. Not a push, not a grab. She slapped me, open-handed across people in it. They went completely still. They went completely still. I heard someone's breath stop. I stood there. My face was warm. My heart was going at about twice its normal speed, and something in me that had been quiet and patient and careful for 3 years just stopped. I said, "Do not ever touch me again." She stepped closer, and I want to be clear about the sequence because I've replayed it so many times. She stepped closer, and then she said, "Don't you speak to me like that in my home?" And then she slapped me again. The second one was harder. I walked out of the kitchen. I walked through the party, which had gone partially quiet in that particular way, where people are pretending they haven't heard anything. I found my mom. I said, "I need to step outside." She looked at my face, and she followed me without a word. We stood on the front step. It was cold. Late October in Alberta, the air had that particular edge that goes straight through your coat. I told her what happened. My voice was steady, which surprised me. My face was still warm. My mum said, "Where's your phone?" I called her, not to cry, to tell her exactly what had happened, so there was a record, so someone outside of that house knew. And then I texted Jess and Preet, "Come outside." Now, Preet was there in 30 seconds. Jess in under a minute. Preet took one look at my face and said, "We're leaving." I said, "Not yet," because Daniel hadn't come out. He knew something had happened. He must have. The kitchen was right there. Sound travels in that house. But he hadn't come outside. He hadn't texted. He hadn't followed me. I went back in. I found him near the fireplace, still with the uncle, though the uncle had gone quiet. Daniel saw me and I watched something happen in his face, a flicker of something, guilt maybe, or dread. And he said, "Rachel." I said, "Your mother slapped me twice, in front of witnesses." He closed his eyes. I said, "I need to know what you're going to do about that." He said, She gets upset. I'll talk to her, I promise. Can we just, not tonight? Can we just get through tonight? That sentence. Can we just get through tonight? I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about 3 years. I thought about the Sunday phone calls and the 47-minute proposal call, and the guest list and the phrase, "not the kind of family we're accustomed to." I thought about all the small moments I had filed away and never retrieved. I said, "I'll be outside." I went back out. I stood with my mum and Jess and Preet in the cold. A few minutes later, Lorraine's friend Sandra came out and handed me a paper towel. I think she thought I'd been crying, but I hadn't, and she said, quietly, "That was not okay. I want you to know that." I thanked her. I still think about Sandra sometimes. About 20 minutes later, Daniel came outside. He looked exhausted. He said, "She's saying you provoked her." I felt something go very still inside me. I said, "I understand." He said, "I'm not saying I believe that. I don't know what to do here, Rachel." I said, "I know, and I did know. That was the thing. I understood exactly what was happening and exactly what it meant, and I was sad about it in a way that was clean and clear, which I think is sometimes how you know something has ended properly." I said, "I'm going to go, and when you figure out what you believe, you can let me know." He said my name. I didn't stop. We drove back to Calgary. My mum came with me. We didn't talk much. At some point, she put her hand on my arm, and I let her. The next morning, Lorraine called me. I know, I didn't expect it either. She called from a number I recognized, and I sat there watching my phone for 3 full rings before I answered, because part of me was curious. Curious in the way you are about things that have already lost their power to hurt you. She said she was calling to address what had happened. She said she had spoken to Daniel. She said, and I want to get this right, because the phrasing was very specific. She said that she had perhaps acted impulsively, and that she thought it would be beneficial for everyone if we could put this behind us and move forward. She did not say she was sorry. She said acted impulsively. She said beneficial for everyone. I said, I appreciate you calling, and then I said, I want you to know that I've spoken to a lawyer this morning about what constitutes common assault in Alberta, and I have the names and contact information for 3 witnesses who were in that kitchen. I'm not making any decisions right now, but I want to be clear that I'm aware of my options. There was a pause. She said, I don't think that's necessary. I said, neither do I, ideally. But I do think an apology is necessary, a real one. Another pause. She said, I'm sorry you felt hurt. I said, that's not an apology for what you did. It's an apology for how I felt. Silence, I said. I'll let you know when I've made a decision about the charges. And I hung up. I want to be honest. I had Googled Common Assault Alberta at 6 in the morning with my coffee going cold beside me. I had not yet actually spoken to a lawyer, but everything I said was technically accurate. I did have the names of 3 witnesses. I had looked up the relevant sections of the criminal code, and I genuinely was undecided about what to do. That all remained true. The lawyer part came later that week. I called the firm my company used for contract work and spoke to one of their associates, who told me that yes, what had happened was technically an assault, that I had strong grounds for a complaint, and that documentation and witness accounts would be important. She did not pressure me either way. She just told me what I was dealing with. I appreciated that. The clarity of it. Daniel and I spoke 3 times over the following 2 weeks. Long, careful conversations that had the texture of people trying to dismantle something large without making too much noise. He kept saying he loved me. I believed him. That was never the question. The question was whether love, on its own, was a workable foundation when the person you loved had never once in his life chosen himself over his mother and showed no signs of starting. I thought about what it would look like, the wedding, the first Christmas, the first time we had a difficult decision to make. I thought about Sunday phone calls and 47 minutes, and she's just upset, she gets upset. I thought about where I would be standing in 10 years and whether I would recognize myself there. On a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the party, I called Daniel and told him I was ending the engagement. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because of my mum. I said, because of how you respond to her. He said, that's not fair. I said, I know it doesn't feel that way. But Daniel, she hit me. Twice. In front of people. And your first response was to ask me to get through the night. He didn't answer that. I said, I think you're a good person. I genuinely do. I think you need to do some real work on this for your live of a life with someone, and I hope you do. But I can't be the person waiting on the other side of that. We were quiet for a moment. Then he said, is there anything I can say? I said, not tonight. I returned the ring the following Saturday. I drove to his apartment. He met me at the door. I handed him the box. He looked like he hadn't slept much. I probably didn't either. He said, I'm sorry. I should have come outside sooner. It was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks, and it came too late, and I think we both knew that. I said, take care of yourself, Daniel. He nodded. I left. The complaint. I thought about it for a long time. I talked to my mum. I talked to Jess. I went back to the lawyer once more. In the end, I chose not to file. Not because what Lorraine did was acceptable, and not because I was afraid of the process, but because I had spent 3 years managing my own reactions around that woman, and I was exhausted by the idea of spending more of my energy on her. I wanted the door closed, not propped open by a file number. What I did do was write a letter. To Lorraine, directly. I wrote it over 4 drafts, each one a little less angry than the last, until the final version was just clear. I named what she had done. I named the witnesses. I told her that I had consulted a lawyer and had chosen, for my own reasons, not to pursue formal charges, but that I wanted her to understand that her behavior had been witnessed, documented, and taken seriously. I told her that I wished her son well. I sent it registered mail, so there was a delivery confirmation. I heard later, through Jess, who had stayed in loose contact with Sandra, that Lorraine had shown the letter to Daniel and described it as a threat. Daniel had apparently said, "She has every right to send it." That's surprised me. I'm still not sure what to do with that. My mum keeps the letter I wrote in a folder she calls her Proud of Rachel folder. She won't tell me what else is in it. I'm not going to tell you that I've healed completely, or that I have no moments where I replay that kitchen and think about what I should have said differently. I do. But what I think about most isn't the slap, or the phone call, or even the letter. What I think about most is Sandra handing me a paper towel and saying, quietly, "That was not okay." How much that cost her to say that at a party full of people who were pretending not to have heard. How little it cost her, really. How small the act was and how large it landed. I think about what it means to be a witness, to not look away. There was no mistress in this story, no hidden affair, no dramatic revelation. There was just a mother who had never been told no, and a son who had never learned to say it, and a version of love that asked me to stand still and take it. I chose not to.